So I'd like to welcome everyone to New Mexico Highlands University homecoming events, our virtual events. Thank you all for attending. I'd like to introduce Mr. Charles Padilla. He will be talking to us a little bit about the history of the Mora Valley and why everybody's from there in some way or another. Something that I can truly attest to on my travels throughout the United States. So, Mr. Padilla, please take it. Actually, let me just, one housekeeping. Please enter your questions into the chat and Mr. Padilla will take them as he's looking at them. I will, if he looks over one or two there, I will remind him of them and kind of monitor in that way. Mr. Padilla, all yours.
Thank you very much. Am I muted, unmuted? I'm fine, right? You can all hear me? Well, let me give you my history real quick. My father was a barber in Mora for many, many years, 55 years. In 1958, he and my mother moved us from Mora to come to school in Santa Fe, but we never left the valley. And what went inside me was the green grass, the cows, the horses, and I hated Santa Fe, but I loved my schools. And because my mother was with 9 kids here, and we would commute to Mora every weekend to see my dad, that commute allowed me to start being an observer. From the time I was a little kid, I was looking at things. And certainly from my experience at Highlands, I got my degree in journalism. One thing that I was very lucky about early in my life was that I fell in love with the library. And I've always read. And then I've been in the insurance business for the last 48 years. And one of the things that I came to find out about is that when I meet a family named Garcia from Leduc, or I see a family named Garcia from Las Vegas, what's happened in our world is that everybody says that a Cassidy is a Cassidy, a Martinez is a Martinez, and a Padilla is a Padilla, and they're all monolithic. It's all the same thing. And they all call us now Latinos or whatever the hell you want to name it. And so the label's attached. But I can tell you that when I drove Alan Weber around northern New Mexico when he was deciding to run for governor, I said, the one thing that I don't want you to do ever is to go think that these families from Cuesta who are named Garcia are monolithic, because they are diametrically different than those families that are from Mora who are named Garcia. So that's a different, and you have to really recognize the public to whom you're trying to serve. And each of these families represents an independence from all other families. And so what I'd like to address today is a little bit of history about why so many people that you meet all have a common core, in that somewhere along the way they pass through Mora. And the Mora history in my abstract here, if you look, 1693 is a big date. That was when Don Diego de Vargas reclaimed New Mexico for Spain, and they settled the issues with the Indians. And prior to that, if you just go to the church at Acoma, and my visit there to that church changed my life, only because the placard said this was started in 1680, and then the Indians had enough in it was started in 1600, the Indians had enough in 1680 and threw everybody out. Well, that was a big deal for me to see. Now, in 1693, my dad's family, the Casados family from Cleveland, arrives in New Mexico. And they arrive with a guy named Jacques. They arrive with not Jacques Gourlay, although he was there, but he came with Juan de Archibec. And Juan de Archibec is a very interesting character because he had a hand in the murder of Robert Cavalier Le Sueur de La Salle when they were shipwrecked at Matagorda Bay in Texas. And they were rescued, put in chains, and they were sent to Zacatecas to work in the mines. Don Diego de Vargas has a hard time putting together the expedition to come to New Mexico. And he sees these young guys in the mines, and they're going to die by the time they're 30. And he says, look, if you come to New Mexico, we'll clean the slate and you'll be okay. So these two families get together to start the Casados family in New Mexico. My family, the Maes family, M-A-E-S-E, they arrived in 1632. My dad's family arrived in Mora. They were just in the land south of Albuquerque. They arrive at La Savoya in Mora, three brothers, the Padillas. They arrive in 1642. And so that comprises the core of our family until we get to 1830. By 1806, there were French trappers that were coming into Mora. The French presence was well known. The French had to avoid the Comanches, who controlled the plains by then. Anything that happened in the high plains, in the whole Midwestern part of the United States, was controlled by the Comanches. And they had gotten the horses from the Spanish in 1680. And by 1710, they were doing selective breeding. And they became the first people to use a horse as a breastwork in battle. And they were the best horsemen in the world right here by 1706 or 1806. Now remember that right around 1806, Lewis and Clark are just getting back to report to Thomas Jefferson. And what they had said to them was, stay away from those guys in New Mexico because that's the Spanish and we don't want to have anything to do with them. So then the people around Cordova, Trampas, Picoris, and Penasco are starting to look for more land so that they could have a better ganado trading economy. And they start pushing over the mountain into Mora by 1810. And by 1816 in Cleveland, where Paul's from, they were asking for a priest. And then in 1832 or 1834, somewhere there, 1835, then they established the Mora Land Grant. The Mora Land Grant was 2 plazas, one in San Antonio and one in Santa Gertrudis, which was in Mora. And what they did was, off of these plazas, they cut pieces of land so that everybody got a stretch of land that had part of the river. It had a piece of irrigated land so that you could plant your gardens. And then it had a stand of mountain to the hillside so that you could get your wood. So that was the economy that was established in Mora. And then everyone shared what I call the commons, okay? And the commons was, for them, that was sort of their savings account where they could send their children to take care of cows or goats or whatever they had. And so they continued with the economy that they had established since 1835, or rather since 1600. By 1635, when they arrive in Mora, the Maes family, the Muniz family, and the Medina family establish El Alto Altalco, and they build a church in their compound there in honor of Santiago. And that church is still standing today. It was remodeled by the Medinas and the Valdezes in 1942. And on the 25th of July is Santiago's Day. On the 26th, it's Santa Ana. And so we have a celebration in Mora, Santiago and Santa Ana, that goes on all the way to today. It's starting to die off a little bit, and I'll get to that story. Is everybody with me so far? We've got a very fast timeline from covering roughly 235 years from 1600 to 1835. We are in Mora. Things are starting to change in the United States with a policy called Manifest Destiny. Okay, and that made it a little tough for the Indians on the East Coast because the colonies are wanting to expand, and they come all the way to Arkansas. Arkansas becomes a state, and 1835 is a big time in the United States. And then we get into 1847. The United States comes and claims New Mexico as a territory. And so people of Mora have to gather around. General Kearny comes in, they burn down the town. The town of Santa Gertrudis all had wooden ceilings. And there's a guy that comes into Mora at the same time, and he's called Saint Vrain. Saran Saint Vrain is buried behind the cemetery in Mora, or behind the Mora High School. There's a small cemetery there, and his wife is also buried there. Her name was Gallegos. And so Saran Saint Vrain does two things that are interesting in 1847. He leaves his house in Mora. Now here's a guy that established the Santa Fe Trail, and he's moved to Mora, and he's married a local gal. So Saran says he comes to Santa Fe, and they put him in charge of the 1st Missouri Volunteers. And so things blow up in Taos. They're coming down to the canyon at Embudo. They're going to resist joining the United States. And Saran Saint Vrain is the head of this division of the 1st Missouri Volunteers. They meet in a battle there. 78 of the Taos people are killed. Saint Vrain comes back to Santa Fe, goes on to Mora, and gets in bed with his wife. What else is there to do? And so he's got a nice house there. He's living there. Everything's normal. He just went up and killed 78 people. That's fine. Then he gets the biggest bit of insider news at that point in the history of the United States to that point. They are going to establish the biggest garrison outside of Washington, D.C., and they are going to establish by 1851 a garrison to protect the old Santa Fe Trail. And that establishes Fort Union. Now we get a little quiet. 1860 comes, there's a war that started, the Civil War. And we get through the war, the United States wins that. for all intents and purposes, slavery is ended. The South is not going to rely on all this cheap labor. And then what happens in 1870 is the United States goes into probably at least one of the most severe depressions in our history. And the markets have failed. Nothing's working. They don't know what to do. And somebody very innocently in Washington, D.C. says, well, what have we always done? We've expanded, we've grown, we've added to our territory. And so they say, well, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we got to get rid of all the Indians. So now the policy of genocide and annihilation gets going. One of the Indian groups that they have to get rid of are the Comanches. And the Comanches at that point they've marginalized France, they've marginalized New Mexico, they've held everybody in check, and they have a giant trading business with the United States, and they're doing very well. Well, the way that they did it was they killed 6,000 of their horses at Palo Duro Canyon. The Comanches would, right below the rim of the headquarters of the Bell Ranch, as you go off of that escarpment, the Comanches used to winter as many as 40,000 horses there over the winter because it was a protected space and the horses would do well through the winter time there. The Comanches are gone. Because of Fort Union and the need for flour, then Paul Cassidy's grandparents decide, along with Syrians and Jewish mercantilists, that maybe Mora would be a good place to establish their mercantile houses to engage in the trade of hides and wool and agricultural products, especially wheat. Now then, if we skip to the next 10 years, all of a sudden, Las Vegas is going well, and Mora is now a mercantile economy. It's starting, they've got a hotel, they've got trading houses. The Cassidys established a very, very large trading business in Mora. And we go forward from there, and the railroad gets to Las Vegas. And I was just in Rochester, Minnesota, and we drove through the countryside, and the amount of corn that I saw was nothing short of unbelievable. So now then, we have finished white flour, and these two companies are established, one called Gold Medal Flour, the second one was Pillsbury. And with their establishment and the railroad, then now Las Vegas and Mora are linked to the East Coast. What are we going to do? We've just spent 250 years of a trading cooperative economy with the Pico de Isa, all of the Indians in Taos, Española, San Juan. Everybody's getting along and everybody's trading apples for chili, chili for something, oats, and everybody's getting along. And now comes the economy of the United States. Along with this, the United States now says, we're going to adjudicate your land claims. And so they hire the lawyers to come from Indiana. And they say, you guys go over there, deal with the Mexicans, sort out their land claims. So what do? Rather than sorting them out, they take all the water. So if they froze you out of your water and they took your commons, they didn't have to take all of the commons, they just had to take the water sources to make you unviable. Okay, so now starts a new era for those people in Mora, because now what had been their savings account, this was a floating savings account because you had the commons. Now, it didn't last very long. The commons was always in place before the land grants. You still could use common lands from 1600 forward. And in fact, when you look at a map of New Mexico, I'm always impressed by the fact that there is Amarillo. There's St. John's, Arizona, that was originally named San Juan. There's Pueblo, Colorado, Pueblo, and El Paso and Las Cruces. And so that by 1870, the Spanish had spread out all over the place, okay? And now with the loss of the commons, they're having to shrink what was otherwise their savings account, because now the United States has come in to adjudicate their land, and you damn sure know that that land is not going to the locals, it's going to the guys that are coming in. And so now a cattle economy comes to the West. I'm not going to get too far into that, but that now with things like climate change and grazing and forest service and all of this stuff has set us up for an ecological disaster today. But back to 1870, we're now starting to see the beginning of the loss of all of these properties. And we're starting to see that people are having to encumber their property in order to buy things like coffee, rice, and beans, okay? So mortgages start to come, even with Paul Cassidy's grandparents, they had to be very careful because they really couldn't, they didn't need land. They needed their capital to be able to move their goods. It didn't make sense for them to have a whole lot of land because they could have anybody that had land that was going to trade with them and give them what they grew. So, but the mortgage system came in, and that led to a little bit more erosion of the land base. Okay, so we're at 1870. Now we move to 1880. The railroad comes to Las Vegas, and things start to change in Mora. Okay, now there's freighters. Guys are bringing goods from Mora. They're bringing flour. They're bringing lumber. Agapito Abeta sets up a lumber mill up there in above Walker Flats. There's a little bit of mining going on. And then what happens starts to get interesting. Right around 1900, you need a way to feed this industrial machine that you have going in the United States, and you need a product called steel, okay? And therefore, you need another product called heat. So now you see the mines in Terrero, in Pecos, and you see the mines come into Dawson. And then in particular, you see the mines coming into Trinidad. So they need a thing called cheap labor. And then the other thing that starts to happen is that because now the United States controls all the land, then they start with the Homestead Acts. And the Homestead Acts are coming right along after the Civil War. They're giving away free land to anybody that'll settle it. And here are the Homestead Acts that are coming. And so now for the Maes family, my mother's family, they get together with the Valdezes, they get together with a whole group of people that they had, and they go homestead land in Wagon Mound. And they got 2,500 acres of adjoining land. Now, the big landowners that had taken the commons were on the road right around Golondrinas and where the Thal Ranch is today, roughly in that area. The Spanish maintained their holdings north of Golondrinas, south of Golondrinas, that became the large landowners. The Spanish maintained north of Ocatay and south of Ocatay and east of Ocatay, that became the new land barons of the New West, new cattle companies, all of them coming from outside and acquiring very, very large pieces of property. Okay, so the squeeze us on. If you're the guy that just has his little lindero in Mora, you're in trouble. You don't have a way to feed yourself. You don't have a way to keep your cattle anymore. And you have now lost the commons, and you've now joined the wider United States. And this starts getting into the point that I wrote. Why does it seem like everybody that you meet at some point came to Mora? What happened in Mora was, you can imagine that by 1860, it was starting to get to be a big deal. And so the Christian brothers decided that they would establish St. Michael's College in Mora. And the Sisters of Loreto did the same thing at Santa Gertrudis. Okay? And so Mora was more of the economic heart of New Mexico. And Santa Fe at that point was very, very marginal. And so Mora had a better trading economy through their system that had been there in place for a long time called the ganado, but they hadn't had the incursion of the United States yet. So by 1906, with the Homestead Acts, then whatever land you were grazing now was going to be gone. Okay? And so my relatives, my great-grandparents, were very forward-thinking. And they said, you know, if we get a piece of land over there, it's only 60 miles from here. We can take the cows to that ranch in Wagon Mound, and we can bring them back in the winter, and we can grow our hay with what land we have. So now you start to see an outmigration of people from Mora to Clayton to Springer to Wagon Mound to Maes, south and east of Las Vegas. Now you have these big pieces of property that are now available for homesteading, and a lot of the Spanish people from Mora are able to benefit this. Okay, so they are able to hold on to their ganado culture for another 2 generations. My mother's father and his father were, and one of their brothers were the last two of that bunch of people that were in her family. This was my mother's uncles. The rest of them had to go to a place called Cheyenne, Wyoming. Okay. And it's no secret that one of the guys that went to Cheyenne was Paul's father, Dan Cassidy, because he could no longer make it in the flour mill economy in Mora. And exactly in 1958, he moved his family away. And so it was very interesting that my family moved away. My dad moved us away in 1958. For some reason, he could see the writing on hand wall, or on the writing was on the wall. Now then, we're back to 1906. And now we have the Homestead Acts. And this is really starting to be the end of an economy that had lasted for 300 years. And it had worked well to support the families. And they only really believed in three things. It was God, and it was their crops, and it was their families. Okay, so and so they had religion. In my family, when I grew up, our whole life centered around the church. We all centered around St. Gertrude's Church. That was everything for us. And but then there was also something that was interesting, because it was really fascinating when my uncles came to visit, because one of my uncles was a cook in the prison in Rawlins, Wyoming. And he introduced us to the word vacation. He would bring his children to Mora and have a vacation, which we had never heard before. Boy, that was like white heat. We never knew that. And so they would come, and they had baseball gloves, and they had all kinds of neat stuff. And my other uncles would come to visit their sister, my mother's mother. And they would come from Wyoming, or from Casper, or from Laramie. And they worked in the railroads. They worked in sheep herding. My mom's father in the 1930s he would leave in the spring and come back in the fall. So they would plant their crops in Mora and move to Wyoming. And in my back bedroom, I have his metal suitcase. And it's not a very big suitcase. It wouldn't be enough for me to go away for the weekend, but somehow he would pack his 2 shirts or 2 pair of pants, and he mortgaged a piece of property in Mora that where he could build himself a house, and he raised 7 children there. And in the springtime, they would leave. And this was after he had worked as a freighter. Okay, so the freighting business, the cars come in the 1930s. Now you don't need the horses anymore. Therefore, you don't need these guys that are going to be hauling freight. You don't need a team of horses. What are we going to do? We got to go. And my grandfather went and did the resupply of the high mountain grazing camps in Steamboat, Colorado. Wherever that was, God knows. So all of the men from Mora would gather together in the 1920s, the teens. It was a terrible time. Everybody had to say goodbye. if it happened that you died in one of these places, you couldn't have a funeral. There wasn't going to be a body, but they would send the shoes. Imagine that. So now we're to where some of these people are starting to leave the valley. How do you do that? We've been here 100 years. We've been here 300 years. How do you leave New Mexico? And so that brings me to I was showing my driver's license at the Denver airport, and I happened to see the girl with her little name tag, and she's checking the licenses. And her name is Abeta. And her grandmother was Max Abeta's daughter. And we always remembered her husband because his name was Sunday. That was a weird name. Why would you ever name a guy Sunday? His name was Sunday, and this was their granddaughter. And I said, would you happen to be related to these people? And she says, yes, that's my grandmother. And then I met this guy on the airplane, and he broke my heart because I asked him what his last name was, and he said, Medina. Well, I know where he came from. He's a relative of mine. We're both on the airplane. And I said, do you know where you're from? And his answer was, I'm from Garcia, Colorado. And I said, that's the happiest bit of horse shit I ever heard, because that is entirely false. You're from Mora, New Mexico. Oh, no, can't be. I'm from here. So for the last 15 years, I've shown horses. I've hauled horses all the way to Houston 5 times. I've been all over the place to Denver. I meet all kinds of people with wonderful Hispanic histories. And so as often as I can, I give this talk because and the reason that I do that is you can never forget your past. Excuse me for a minute. I think that we have such a connection that you can never ignore it. And so I'll stop there, and I hope that you've enjoyed this story. I hope that I've made some element of sense, but wherever you go, whatever you do, you will always find that people came from Mora. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Padilla. We actually do have some time for questions. If anyone wants to type in their question in the chat box, we can continue that way. I guess I'd like to start with the first one, Mr. Padilla. I am curious what the word Altalco means.
The reason that they named it that was that the road to Las Vegas, did not go through the current road around La Vuelta de los Romeros down through La Cueva. The road to Las Vegas actually cut in that little saddle between what was El Camino del Medio. Okay, that was the way that you got into all of your properties. That was a common road. And then you would take that road to the first community was Altalco. And that's the rise in the hill. And when you covered that, then you would go to El Carmel, down into Sapeo and into the plains, and that's how you would get to Las Vegas. So I think Altalco probably means the passage or the little high spot.
So the road was through El Carmel and then through Cebollita. And
yes.
then Cebollita, then it took what is now 518.
Yes.
Between the two valleys there.
Right. And you had to pick the easiest place to get by. So, and that place remains, for me, that was my mother's family. Now, the other interesting part, I'll say this very quickly. My mother, my mother's grandfather was Toribio Maes. He was born in 1859. His sister, Porfiria Maes, was born just a little bit later, a year or so later. There were three brothers, Valdezes, that came from Abiquiu because they were looking for a little bit better property. They were looking for better land. And Porfiria gets together with Roman Valdez. And they don't have 5 children. They have 16. And they settle in what is now Las Aguitas. Okay, that's a whole crew of those guys. And they are everywhere. The oldest one of those ladies died in Manassas, Colorado in 2004. And she was 106 years old. So even when you go to Alamosa, they've populated all that whole place with Valdezes. And they're all over Santa Fe. It's amazing what you see. And they all came from Mora. That's their route. And so when I go to Mora every Memorial Day, I clean, sometimes I clean 30 graves, depending on who I find and what I do. I go clean graves and I spend my time, my dad did that. He would go clean a couple of graves, and now I've just studied the names. And so the other thing is that if you want to send me an email, I don't know, Edward, did I send you that piece called Ganado?
Yes, you did.
And in the back of that, it has we did a genealogy. And that little project took about a year to trace everybody. But then when you looked at that and you looked at the timeline of the United States, you can say what was happening, just like what I've talked about today. So it was sort of interesting.
We have a couple of questions. Mr. Cassidy wanted you to share with us a little bit about your NMHU education, and then also where can we find the history that you've written about?
Well, just send me an email and I'm more than happy to send it. I probably sent, I don't know how many, maybe a couple of thousand. I wrote this, it was very important when my dad died in 2003. I knew that a lot of history was lost and that he hadn't talked about. And while my mother could still make coffee, I came to her with a giant piece of paper and I had her give me all of the names. And then we started tracing them. And the easiest way to trace names is through the New Mexico Hispanic Genealogy Society. It's a lot harder through the Mormon Church because the Mormon Church does not, they don't include the family name or the children's names of each marriage. And so this Hispanic genealogy thing in Albuquerque is really the best resource. And then what's interesting then is that the names are grouped roughly in 20-year segments, okay? You go back 20 years and you'll find the guy. Then you go back 20 years and you'll find the next guy. And so Social Security records are the way to first get started because you'll see the death records in there and the census records from, say, 1918. And then you can go back. The other thing about my education is I started in the insurance business when I was at Highlands, and I was a sophomore, and I went into business. And before that, I had sold newspaper stories. And prior to that, I had spent about, when I was in high school, I became the mail boy at the School of American Research here. And then I went to an archaeology dig with them in the Grand Canyon. And then I helped them dig at Arroyo Hondo, which was a 800 room block that we did. And I was always more than happy to work. I loved working. And they liked me because I was a good worker. And so when my dad moved us to Santa Fe, he didn't move us to the Spanish part of town. He moved us to the white Jewish part of town. And so we were the poorest kids around. So we always had to hide from all the other kids. And we even had it down to where nobody knew where we lived. Nobody knew what kind of car we had. I mean, it was just what you called a relaje, you know? And so when we got to Mora, we were rich, you know, but when we got here, boy, we were poor as hell. We were 8 kids in 3 rooms. One year we didn't have a bathroom for a whole year. We had an outhouse. And so my Highlands education with time, I think, has, at the beginning when I graduated, I was very angry because things had changed at Highlands and I was not happy. But with time, I have come to understand what happened at Highlands and what happened with everything, why all of that happened. And it even comes back now to Black Lives Matter and all of these other things where we have to change the way that we are. And so I thank God that the other thing is that in my sisters, there were 5 of us that went to Highlands out of the 8. And for my parents, out of 22 grandchildren and 8 children, they have graduated 27 from college. That's a 90% batting average. And so my decision to go to Highlands wasn't a really well thought out decision. I could have done a lot of other things, but that was sort of like my default choice because I hadn't thought about it. It was time to go, and I did. And with time, it has really been the best thing that ever happened to me, and I can say that unequivocally.
A few more questions. I guess being from that area, I know some of the history of the names of the places there that weren't the original names. And so Leduc and Cleveland and Holman are all places that all names that came later. And then also, there's also a question, if you could talk a little bit about that. And then there's also a question about Rainsville and your knowledge about that area.
Well, Rainsville is, you have to understand Rainsville, you have to go to Coyote Creek and Guadalupita. And you have to follow that drainage to understand how you get to Rainsville, okay? And this is a new name, okay? They named it for a man, I think his name was Gordon Rains, okay? And it used to be a place called Los Luceros, okay? So those names changed. Cleveland, when Grover Cleveland was president, they wanted to have a regional postal system. And so every town had to have a name, and they didn't like San Antonio, okay? Just like Holman was Agua Negra, okay? So they changed them. Well, that wasn't fair. That wasn't the name of the place, but so now we live in a bifurcated world of names, okay? And Rainsville is very, very important because there's some families there that are rooted there in Rainsville. And you wonder why that happens, because it's sort of a dry plain. There's some irrigation. It's dry. It's not really attractive, like Mora, say, for instance. It's not in a valley. But there's the Pachecos there, the Luceros. Those are relatives of mine, and there's a grouping of people in there that are very, very important just because they stayed there and they held that place together. Okay, and somehow they resisted the change. And now, one of the things to understand that, when I went to Highlands, today in Las Vegas, I think there's 6 doctors. When I went to Highlands, there were over 30. That was in 1970. So the other thing that you see today that I want to say something about is to understand these migrations. One of the things that I realized when they brought a play to Santa Fe from the Mora High School, what I saw was a word called incarceration. Okay, and that's a relatively new word from roughly the last 20 years. There has been a systematic movement in criminal justice to incarcerate people. Okay, so we have a new jail in Santa Rosa. We have here. I live in the most beautiful town in the world. But what the hell are we doing with 600 people in jail? What the hell is that all about? And then we have all of these guys that have to go from Mora and they commute to Santa Rosa to work in a friggin' jail. And if they don't go there, they have to go to Clayton. And so the migrations that happen, what I saw in that play was just this beautiful thing of people coming together to create something very good. And they had a very enlightened high school principal named Chavez, who and his children became some of the most successful runners that ever came out of Mora. They're really top flight. And so when you see that in direct contradiction to jails, there's nothing sadder in my mind than driving into Las Vegas and looking over to the left and seeing that jail as the entrance to those valleys. And I have to think, my God, what have we done to ourselves? Okay. Why has this become so important that we can't solve it in some other way? And so when I look at the economy and what I've talked about here, I can see how this happens, okay? Because the economy has fallen apart and we don't know how to solve it. But the effects of it, when you look back at time and place and home place and where you lived, then and what's happening with more people being incarcerated. My God, I have to wonder where we're going.
Talking about the economy, I wanted to see if we can squeeze one more question in there. I'm not sure. Let's see. I don't see any more, so I'm going to take advantage of the time. My understanding, I read a book from an author by the name of Dubuis not too long ago. Land of Enchantment and Exploitation, I believe, was the title of the book, and he talks about the logging of what is now the Santa Fe National Forest, the Carson National Forest, and I believe that this logging was happening in the early 1900s, and where many of the railroad ties came from for the railroad. And I'm wondering if you know any of that history, and my understanding is that there were chutes that were coming off the mountain into El Rio Pueblo that would then empty out in an embudo, and then from embudo then into the Rio Grande, and then further down south. I'm just wondering, because I know that the people from Mora have a big history of being loggers, that they worked the forest.
Yes, and there was a time for that in 1908 with Theodore Roosevelt. That was when the Forest Service was established, and they had an attitude that anything was fair game if we were going to grow the economy, and therefore you could log the forest. Now then, later on, now Dubois just I know him because I was on the board of trustees of the College of Santa Fe when I met him, and we established a film school there. And a must read for anybody that's listening to me is his book called The Great Aridness, because it's a study from the year 700 forward. I just read it again last week, and he talks about climate change and what has happened with this Forest Service policy that has been so destructive. Now we have, I don't know how big the fire is in Chacon today, but it blew up 6,000 acres yesterday. I wrote to my neighbor, I own a piece of land in Tromperos, and I wrote to my neighbor, Ben Lujan, and I told him to move his cows to my place and let them eat everything that there was there, and get a tank of water so that they had something to drink, but go clean it out. You know, the fences are good. Move your cows, please. Take it. You know, because these guys are now, they're in trouble because we're in a drought, and they did not get hay to put up now, and they're hurting. So the savings account economy is in cattle. The logging, the business that you talk about with these flumes that they used to make, those were a thing called tide drives, okay? And you would do those drives in the wintertime, And the men that went up there into the mountains got a little condition called squeaky heel, okay, because your Achilles tendon would tighten up. And they would use bacon at night to try to loosen up their tendon because their heels would squeak all day long, hurt like hell, because they were always working in snow. And so in order to get the logs, in order to make a tie, you had to cut the log. You know, you or another guy or you by yourself, you cut the log, dragged it over there to the flume, and then you sent it down and it would hit a frozen river. And then, and this was especially true in the Green River in Wyoming. And there were millions of ties that were caught or cut in those mountains. Now, it also happens that the railroads had a big impact because when they extended the railroads, they gave them land, and I think the number was 2 miles on either side of the track. So a lot of the large ranches that were put together started with railroad grants, and those started in the 1880s. And again, this was one of those economic events that doesn't sound like a big deal when you say we're going to put the railroad in, until all of a sudden you tie it to what was the economic loss of the commons. Okay, and the loss of the commons really is, you did have to go to the modern world, but the modern economy did not hold together now for ordinary people. Okay, and so everything is in a dynamic. Paul knows this more than anybody else that I could ever talk to, but everything is dynamic and everything is changing, and trying to keep up and understand what the changes are is something that's it's hard to do. And I somehow, maybe what I've done here is that I've told a false narrative. Maybe I've got it all wrong, okay? But at least I can sell myself that I understand how it's coming, okay? And then the last thing I'll tell you guys, I'll share it with you, it's good news. My daughter will deliver a baby in the next few hours. And we go one more generation here. So that's cool.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Padilla. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Lots of knowledge about the Mora Valley. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. We'll say goodbye.
Okay.
Charles,
Take
Thank
care.
you for joining us.
Godspeed. Good health to you, man.
Great job,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you.
Charles,
Yes.
Gabriel here. Sorry I missed, I got in late. I was writing something up, but I know I saw the outline, so I know it was well, and I know your own story, and we connect into that. So wishing you well, and I know you love Mora, and you know Mora, so good wishes to you.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Great job, Mr. Padilla. Thank you, sir. Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. That was well done. Well done.